In 2007, Florida took 1 million tons of limestone boulders and dumped them 65 feet underwater off the coast of Miami. Marine biologists thought it would take 20 years for coral to colonize the rocks. Within 18 months, the boulders were completely covered in living coral. Within 3 years, the site had more fish species than natural reefs that had been growing for centuries. What should have taken decades happened in months, and scientists still can't fully explain why. This is what Florida accidentally created, why it worked so much faster than anyone predicted, and why the limestone dump might have solved a problem that's been killing coral reefs worldwide. Florida's natural coral reefs were dying. The Florida Reef Tract lost more than 90% of its coral cover. Staghorn coral that once dominated the shallows was nearly extinct. Elkhorn coral colonies that were centuries old were bleaching and dying. By 2005, scientists realized the reef system was approaching total collapse. But here's what was killing them. Climate change was raising water temperatures. Pollution from agricultural runoff was smothering corals with algae. Overfishing was removing herbivorous fish that kept algae under control. And hurricanes were physically destroying coral structures faster than they could regrow. The reef system was facing multiple catastrophic stressors simultaneously. The normal solution wasn't working. Marine protected areas reduced fishing pressure but didn't stop coral death. Water quality improvements helped but couldn't reverse decades of damage. Coral restoration programs where scientists grow coral in nurseries and transplant it to reefs was working, but it was incredibly slow. Growing coral fragments to transplantable size took 18 months. Each diver could only transplant 50 corals per day. Restoring even 1 square mile of reef would take 20 years. Here's the desperate math. Florida's reef tract is 358 miles long. Millions of square feet of dead reef needed restoration. The nursery and transplant method would take centuries to restore what had been lost in 30 years. Scientists needed something faster. They needed an approach that worked at scale. That's when someone suggested just dumping rocks in the ocean and letting nature do the work. The concept was simple. Dump massive limestone boulders on the seafloor in specific patterns to create artificial reef structures. The limestone would provide hard substrate for coral larvae to attach to. Once coral started growing, fish would follow. The ecosystem would rebuild itself naturally. In theory, the skepticism was massive. Critics said dumped rocks wouldn't attract coral because natural colonization takes decades. They said even if coral did grow, it wouldn't create the complex habitat structure that natural reefs provide. They said artificial structures would never support the biodiversity of real reefs. Marine biologists who had spent careers studying reef ecology said the plan was too simplistic. But here's why they did it anyway. The natural reefs were dying so fast that doing nothing meant losing everything. The traditional restoration methods were too slow to matter. If dumping rocks had even a 20% chance of accelerating reef recovery, it was worth trying because the alternative was watching the entire reef system die within 20 years. The logistics were insane. They needed limestone specifically because it's chemically similar to coral skeletons. Coral is calcium carbonate. Limestone is calcium carbonate. The chemical compatibility matters because coral larvae preferentially settle on substrate with similar mineral composition. Using granite or concrete wouldn't work as well because the chemistry is wrong. They sourced 1 million tons of limestone boulders. Each boulder weighed between 300 and 5,000 pounds. They loaded them onto barges, transported them to designated sites, and used cranes to lower them into position 65 feet below the surface. The placement pattern mattered. They arranged boulders in specific configurations to create crevices, overhangs, and vertical structures that mimic natural reef topography. The deployment zones covered specific areas. The largest site was 3.5 miles off Miami Beach, spanning 16 acres. Additional sites were placed off Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach. Each site used between 50,000 and 200,000 tons of limestone arranged in boulder clusters that created complex three-dimensional habitat. Here's what should have happened according to marine biology textbooks. Limestone boulders sit on the seafloor for 5 to 10 years accumulating biofilm. Eventually, a few coral larvae settle and begin growing. You might have 10% coral coverage. After 40 to 50 years, it might resemble a young reef. That's the standard timeline for natural reef colonization. Here's what actually happened. Within 6 months, the boulders were covered in algae and biofilm. Within 12 months, coral larvae had settled and juvenile corals were visible. Within 18 months, coral coverage was 40% on some boulders. By year 3, the site had more coral species than some natural reefs in the area. The colonization happened 10 times faster than predicted, but it wasn't just coral. Fish showed up immediately. Within weeks of deployment, baitfish schools were using the boulders for shelter. Within 3 months, predatory fish species like barracuda and grouper were hunting around the structures. Within 6 months, the fish biomass at the artificial reef sites exceeded nearby natural reef sites. The species diversity was shocking. By year 2, marine surveys found 82 fish species using the artificial reef. That's comparable to natural reefs that have been developing for centuries. Spiny lobsters colonized crevices in the boulder piles. Octopuses moved into small caves created by rock arrangements. Sea turtles started feeding on algae and sponges growing on the limestone. But here's what made scientists realize something unprecedented was happening. Endangered coral species that were nearly extinct in the wild started appearing on the artificial reefs. Staghorn coral fragments that broke off natural reefs during storms attached to the limestone and started growing. Elkhorn coral larvae that had nowhere to settle on degraded natural reefs found perfect habitat on the boulder structures. The growth rates were abnormal. Coral on the artificial reefs was growing 2 to 3 times faster than the same species on natural reefs. A branching coral species that normally grows 2 inches per year was growing 5 inches per year on the limestone boulders. Scientists measured coral coverage increasing 15% per year, when natural reef recovery is typically 1 to 2% per year. Here's the first reason. The limestone chemistry was perfect. Coral larvae have chemical receptors that detect calcium carbonate in seawater. When limestone dissolves slowly, it creates a chemical signal that attracts coral larvae like a beacon. The boulders were essentially advertising their presence to any coral larvae drifting in ocean currents. But the structure mattered just as much as chemistry. Natural reefs are complex three-dimensional structures with caves, crevices, overhangs, and vertical walls. The way the boulders were arranged created similar complexity immediately. Fish don't just need hard surface, they need shelter from predators. The boulder arrangements provided that shelter from day one, which meant fish colonized immediately instead of waiting for coral to grow. Here's the feedback loop that accelerated everything. Fish showed up first because the physical structure provided habitat. Fish excrete waste that fertilizes algae and coral. Fish also control which algae species dominate by eating some and avoiding others. The rapid fish colonization meant the limestone had the perfect balance of algae growth, coral settlement space, and nutrient cycling from the beginning. The current patterns around the sites were perfect by accident. The boulders were placed in areas with moderate current flow. Too little current and sediment smothers coral. Too much current and coral larvae can't settle. The currents at these sites were strong enough to prevent sediment buildup, but gentle enough to allow larvae to settle. This Goldilocks zone of current speed is rare in nature but was achieved through careful site selection. But here's the factor nobody predicted. The artificial reefs became nurseries for coral reproduction. When coral on the boulders reached maturity, they spawned. The limestone structures were so dense with coral that spawning events created massive larval clouds. Those larvae settled on the same reef structures, creating exponential growth. Natural reefs are so spread out that larvae often drift away. The concentrated artificial reefs kept larvae local. Accelerating colonization, temperature regulation played a role. The limestone boulders have thermal mass. They absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. During brief temperature spikes that cause coral bleaching, the limestone boulders buffered temperature changes just enough to reduce bleaching stress. The coral on artificial reefs bleached 30% less than coral on natural reefs during the same heat events. Here's what wasn't expected. The artificial reefs didn't just support coral and fish. They attracted megafauna. Nurse sharks started using the boulder fields as resting spots. Goliath groupers, which can weigh 400 pounds and are endangered, colonized the structures. Sea turtles began incorporating the sites into their feeding routes. Dolphin pods started hunting around the boulder fields because fish density was so high. But the most surprising transformation was ecological complexity. Natural reefs take centuries to develop the full suite of ecological relationships between species. Cleaner fish that remove parasites from larger fish. Symbiotic relationships between gobies and shrimp that share burrows. Coral crabs that defend coral from crown-of-thorns starfish. All of these complex relationships appeared on the artificial reefs within 5 years. The night ecosystem was equally robust. Nocturnal fish species like cardinal fish and squirrelfish used the boulder crevices as daytime shelter. Octopuses and eels hunted at night. Bioluminescent organisms colonized the structures. Within 3 years, the artificial reefs had complete day and night ecological cycles identical to natural reefs. Reproductive success became obvious by year 4. Scientists found juvenile fish that had clearly been born on the artificial reefs. The sites weren't just attracting adult fish from elsewhere, they were functioning as complete ecosystems where fish were spawning, juveniles were surviving, and populations were self-sustaining. That's the definition of successful reef habitat. Here's the data that proved it worked. By 2015, 8 years after deployment, fish biomass at the artificial reef sites was 300% higher than the remaining natural reefs in the area. Coral coverage was 60% compared to 15% on natural reefs. The limestone dumps had become the healthiest reef habitat in South Florida. The artificial reefs were outperforming nature. Here's the brutal reality of coral reef decline. 50% of the world's coral reefs have died since 1980. Another 30% are severely degraded. At current rates, 90% of coral reefs will be dead by 2050. Climate change, pollution, and overfishing are destroying reefs faster than they can recover naturally. Traditional restoration methods are too slow to reverse the damage. But the Florida Limestone Project proved something critical. Reef recovery can be accelerated dramatically if you provide the right substrate in the right location with the right structure. What should take 50 years can happen in 5 years if conditions are optimized. This changes the math on reef restoration from impossible to potentially achievable. The scalability is real. Limestone is cheap, transportation is straightforward. Deployment doesn't require advanced technology. The entire 1 million ton project cost $3 million. That's $3 per ton of reef substrate. Compare that to coral nurseries that cost $200 per coral transplant, and you see why this approach matters. It's 100 times cheaper per unit of reef restoration. Countries with dying reefs but limited restoration budgets can't afford to transplant millions of corals. They can afford to dump limestone boulders. The Maldives, which is losing reefs to rising sea temperatures, started a limestone reef program in 2019. The Philippines deployed 50,000 tons in 2020. Indonesia is planning similar projects. The Florida model is being replicated worldwide. The climate change buffer matters. As ocean temperatures rise, coral bleaching will increase. Having more reef habitat with better temperature buffering characteristics means more coral survives bleaching events. The limestone reefs aren't perfect protection, but they improve survival rates during heat stress. Creating more of this habitat creates more refugia where coral can survive. Here's the economic argument that's convincing governments. Coral reefs generate $375 billion per year globally through fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection. Florida's reefs alone generate $6 billion annually for the state economy. Every dollar spent on limestone reef restoration generates roughly $200 in long-term economic value. That return on investment is hard to ignore. Not everyone thinks dumping limestone is a good solution. Critics argue that artificial structures don't replicate the full complexity of natural reefs. They say focusing on artificial reefs distracts from the real solution, which is stopping climate change and reducing pollution. They point out that artificial reefs are still vulnerable to the same stressors killing natural reefs. But here's the counterargument. Natural reefs are dying right now. Waiting for global climate policy to reverse course means losing everything in the next 20 years. Artificial reefs aren't perfect, but they buy time. They create habitat that supports biodiversity, while humanity hopefully figures out how to stop destroying the ocean. They're a stopgap, not a final solution, but stopgaps matter when the alternative is complete ecosystem collapse. The debate about naturalness is philosophical. Is a thriving artificial reef less valuable than a dying natural reef? If coral, fish, and ecosystem function are identical, does it matter whether the substrate is natural or placed by humans? Marine biologists are split on this question. Ecologists tend to say function matters more than origin. Conservationists worry that artificial reefs reduce urgency for protecting natural ones. Here's what isn't debatable. The Florida limestone reefs are functioning ecosystems, supporting endangered species that had nowhere else to live. Goliath groupers that were critically endangered are reproducing on artificial reefs. Staghorn coral that was nearly extinct has refugia on limestone boulders. Those are conservation wins regardless of how you feel about artificiality. The rapid colonization revealed something unexpected. Coral larvae are more abundant in the ocean than anyone realized. The limiting factor isn't larvae availability, it's suitable settlement substrate. Natural reefs are so degraded they can't support new coral settlement. The larvae are out there drifting, looking for somewhere to settle, and finding nothing. When you provide massive amounts of perfect substrate, larvae appear from everywhere. This changes restoration strategy. Instead of growing coral in nurseries, maybe the solution is creating vast amounts of settlement substrate and letting natural reproduction do the work. This is faster, cheaper, and more scalable. It also maintains genetic diversity because wild larvae from multiple parent colonies settle naturally instead of clones from nursery propagation. But here's the research that's ongoing. Scientists are testing different limestone configurations. Boulder piles versus limestone arches versus vertical limestone walls. Each configuration creates different current patterns, light exposure, and habitat complexity. Optimizing configuration could accelerate colonization even further. They're treating this like engineering, testing variables to improve outcomes. They're also testing strategic placement. Artificial reefs upstream of natural reefs can produce larvae that drift downstream and reseed degraded natural reefs. The artificial reef becomes a coral factory that helps restore areas beyond the immediate deployment zone. This force multiplier effect could make restoration exponentially more effective. The timeline projections are optimistic. Based on current success rates, scientists estimate that deploying 10 million tons of limestone over the next 10 years could restore 50 square miles of functional reef habitat in South Florida. That would reverse 30 years of reef decline in a decade. The numbers actually work if funding and political will align. Florida dumped 1 million tons of limestone underwater because natural reef restoration was too slow. What grew there was a thriving ecosystem that formed 10 times faster than natural reef development. Coral coverage reached 60% in 8 years. Fish biomass tripled compared to natural reefs. Endangered species found refuge. The project worked beyond anyone's predictions. Here's why it matters. Coral reefs are collapsing globally. Traditional restoration is too slow and too expensive. The limestone approach is fast and cheap enough to deploy at the scale needed to make a difference. It's not perfect, but perfect isn't an option anymore. The choice is between trying something unconventional or watching coral reefs go extinct in our lifetime. The Florida limestone reefs are now among the healthiest reef habitats in the Caribbean. What was supposed to be a desperate experiment became the model for reef restoration worldwide. Countries from Asia to the Pacific are replicating the approach. The solution to one of conservation's hardest problems might be as simple as dumping rocks in the right place and letting nature do the rest. What Florida accidentally proved is that ecosystems can recover far faster than we thought if we give them what they need. Sometimes what they need is 1 million tons of limestone and getting out of the way.